Do lobbyists know who the legislators are who are doing their homework and are working hard, and those that are just barely showing up?
Oh, yeah. Over time, if you get to observe a couple hundred legislators like I have, it doesn't usually take long to figure out who's likely to thrive and, who will have a little bit of tougher time.
Have you had relationships with governors over the years?
11. I worked with 11 different governors, 19 presidents of the Senate, 19 speakers of the House.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Alaska State Lobbyist Reed Stoops. After his youth on the East Coast, Reed made his way to Alaska in 1971. He worked as a committee aide to Kay Poland in the Senate, and then took a job at the Department of Natural Resources in the Hammond administration. During the Sheffield administration, he began lobbying, and in 2000, he co-founded the Juneau Community Foundation, which gives away millions of dollars each year to improve the capital city by making Juneau healthier, safer, and more culturally rich.
Reed Stoops, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Where were you born?
I was born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1948. Grew up in a town about the size of Anchorage at the time. Went to high school there. I went to college at Cornell University. Started out as an engineer. Later got a degree in biology. And then I went to graduate school there afterwards and came from graduate school straight to Alaska in 1971.
1971. What was your graduate degree in?
I stopped just short of a master's in teaching.
Okay. And what did you come up to do in Alaska in 71?
I came up as a VISTA volunteer, and I was one of 9 rural cap. I came to work with the Rural Community Action Program. They had 9 regions in the state, so there was a group of 9 of us that came up, and each of us went to a different region of rural Alaska when we got here.
And what did you get assigned to?
I was in the Copper Center region, the Koyukon region, and at that time, it was just pure luck. I got here in 71, and that was the year that the Native Claims Settlement Act was passed, and it was the year that the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was passed. And when I lived in Copper Center, there was pretty much no activity out there the way there would be several years later.
How'd you end up in Juneau?
In Juneau, I switched. I started off in Copper Center, and then I ended up getting transferred briefly to Anchorage and then to Juneau because Juneau had a lot going on here in Southeast Alaska. I ended up here in Juneau in, I think it was November 71. And it wasn't my plan, but
right.
Here I still am.
How fast between that November 71 did you start working in this building in the Capitol?
I think right from the very beginning, Rural Cap spent a lot of time working on state and federal grants and issues. And the communities at that time, a lot of them didn't have health care, a lot of them didn't have schools. So there was a dependence on government. So I started spending a little bit of time here right from the very first year I was in Alaska.
So it was pre-Molly Hooch decision.
Pre-Molly
So
Hooch,
people
right.
were being sent to boarding schools or sent out still.
And Alaska had no money. It was basically a subsistence economy in rural Alaska. And that didn't change until quite a while later when the state actually had some money to spend in rural Alaska.
But you got here after discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay. There was sunshine on the horizon, so to speak, in terms of money.
Yeah, there was. We had received $900 million from the Prudhoe Bay oil lease sale. And at the time I got here, the state's budget was $170 million.
Wow.
And the median age was 22 years old. And Jay Hammond was the president of the Senate at that time. But the state was operating on a shoestring budget, and that $900 million that we received was the first substantial cash that the state had ever received. And there was a lot of debate about how to spend that money.
Do you remember when you walked into the Capitol the first time?
Yep, it reminded me of my junior high school. It wasn't very impressive as a Capitol building.
Some would say it's still not. I mean, there are people who are like, this is not a Capitol building. This is an office building.
It's not, but there's a certain charm to that. It fits with Alaska that we're not a state that aspires to have fancy buildings like the Capitol in California or in some of the other states. And it's improved a lot over the years, but it's the same building I walked into in 1971.
You told me that you've been working since Egan was governor in the building. How long were you with Rural Cap? When did you transition over? What was your first job?
I had about a 10-year period before I started lobbying, but I became the head of the Southeast Community Action Program, which was the rural cap region here in Southeast Alaska. And then I went to work for Department of Community and Regional Affairs under Byron Millott when he was the commissioner at age 29. Spent 2 years there, came to work for the legislature. And
You were around the same age.
yeah, I was young. I was 24 at that time.
Gotcha.
So he was a little bit older, but not a lot.
Mhm.
We were all young in those days.
Right.
And then I came to work for Senator Kay Poland, who was the chairman of the Senate Resources Committee from 76 to 78.
So that was your first official job in the Capitol.
In the Capitol building, yes.
was in 76.
Yeah. And then I went to work for the Department of Natural Resources for 4 years and Governor Hammond's second term. And during that time, I got to work on ANILCA and spent a lot of time back in D.C. working on that legislation. So just by pure luck, I happened to be here for the formative federal legislation that really changed Alaska ever since.
And I mean, you hadn't expected that in Erie, Pennsylvania.
No,
Like
it was so fluke. I came to Alaska as a vista volunteer, partly because I love to go hunting and fishing, and Alaska was going to be a real adventure. I tried to get information on Alaska. I found a couple of articles in Sunset Magazine about Alaska, but we really weren't on the map then. So it was a real eye-opener to come here and actually see what it was like.
That period when you worked for Kay Poland and then when you worked for Department of Natural Resources, that period was a really notorious period for Juneau and the Capitol. Tons of money coming in, tons of money going out, crazy behavior. The coup happened in the house. Do you have any stories from that period?
It was a fascinating period. Remember, the Permanent Fund was established in 76, so I was here in the building when that happened. I was lucky. When I was with the legislature, we set up the Wood River Tick-Tick State Park, which was fun. There was a big debate on oil and gas taxation because that's when the oil production really started, and we were trying to figure out how to tax the oil companies. So that was fascinating. When I was at DNR, I got to make the last round of state selections, and again, worked on ANILCA. I also set up the Haines, the Bald Eagle Preserve in the state forest was one of my projects back in the Hammond days.
Do you remember when the coup happened in the house?
Yep, I remember well.
What was it like from your perspective?
Yeah, it was surprising because I think that's the only time that ever happened in Alaska, and it happened by surprise that Jim Duncan ended up getting the speakership taken away from him, and Joe Hayes took his place, and it was quietly engineered by the Bush caucus at the time.
And I guess, do you recall someone saying, hey, they've locked the doors in the house, or there's something happening?
Yeah.
I mean, there was a television crew there. How much did you know from outside the chambers?
Well, everybody, it was a small state, and Alaska only had about half the people that it had today. And there wasn't the kind of press coverage that we have today in the Capitol building. So everybody around here was aware of what was happening pretty much as it happened. And it was one of those notable events that people still talk about today.
Where were you exactly?
I think I'm trying to remember exactly what year that 81. I was at the Department of Natural Resources across the street. The one thing I recall from those early days where the legislature and the Republicans and Democrats fought on the floor just like they do today. But then when the session was over, everybody would go down to the Baronoff Hotel, and there was the famous Latchstring restaurant and bar down there. Everybody from the building, legislators, lobbyists, press, everybody went down there after work, stayed for dinner. A band started playing about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and everybody had a certain amount of friendship outside the building, even though within the building people defended their parties. And there were a lot of young people at that time. As you recall, the ad hoc Democrats took over the House back in the day, and it was Hugh Malone, Terry Gardner, John Sund, Bob Bradley, Bill Parker, a bunch of 20-something-year-olds that...
But there were also Republicans participating in that. I think that's something that people don't understand, is that the whole coalition-style government is not brand new.
No, the coalition, in fact, going back all the way into the 70s, the coalition government, it was the norm. because the Bush caucus tended to go with either the Republicans or Democrats, depending on where they could cut their best deals. It was very rare to have both sides Democratic or both sides Republican.
Mm-hmm. And did you know that was unusual back then to have Republicans, Democrats in the same caucus?
I think so. And it was mainly because of the Bush caucus, that the Republican and Democratic legislators were always close to more or less evenly divided. And the Bush holding 4 seats could generally be in a position to determine who got the speakership or the Senate presidency. There were times when they went with both parties, just like they did in the last 2 years.
So 2 things. Number one, I did have Disco Ray Metcalf on the podcast. I never released it. It's one that just has to stay in the vault because I don't know that I could provide footnotes to all of his allegations. And I didn't want to cast unfounded aspersions on living people. But he talked a lot about the band playing at the Baranoff and him going every single night, and that he earned that nickname Disco Ray because he did go to the Baranoff every single night.
He also wore shiny suits.
Yeah. And then the second part, I interviewed Reggie Jewell, and he pointed out that the Bush caucus has not always stayed together, and that the Bush caucus has split in half, and that where the Democrats stayed with the Democrats, and that 2 of them have gone with the Republicans, as he did. And it depended on the Bush caucus. Mary Patola famously ran against Ivan, saying that she would not caucus with Republicans, and she didn't. Right. So
there was a period when the early period they would operate as a group. There was a middle period where they didn't, and then they began to do it again. It has varied over time.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that you had mentioned to me why I wanted to have you on the podcast is because you've seen the building, see the happenings in the buildings over so many decades. What to you has changed the most, and what has stayed the same?
I think what's changed the most is that in the early days, the legislators in a smaller state had a statewide perspective. So they cared about their district, but they equally cared about the state as a whole. Over time, as through reapportionment and through changes, the legislators tend to focus more on district politics and to a lesser extent on statewide politics. So that's just a general difference that I've observed. Also, too, when we first got here, there was no internet, and there was not a whole lot of coverage in the legislature. And then over time, we've had gavel to gavel, we've had the internet, we've had tremendous explosion in coverage. So that's really made a difference, because I think everybody behaves a little bit differently under the spotlight than they do when there wasn't so much of one.
That's interesting because, and I guess I'm looking at it through a much more recent lens.
Sure.
But as it's been explained to me, having had Rebecca Braun on, for example, who was reporting in the late aughts, and there was a lot more coverage in the 90s and aughts. Right. And there'd been a falling off of journalism in the last 10 years, so to speak, more dependent on blog coverage, less dependent on actual paid media coverage. There weren't paid journalists to be in the building full time, right, in the way that there had been.
Yeah, and that's true nationally as well,
right,
as well as in the States. So that's really changed over time, and issues have changed, and the economy has changed. And one thing I've learned as a lobbyist is that the world is constant change, and keeping up with that change is difficult, but pretty important.
Who have you lobbied for over the years?
I started lobbying in 1983 after I went back to when Governor Sheffield was elected. I went back with John Katz to Washington, D.C. and worked in D.C. for a little while. But then I came back to Juneau, and my first clients were Linden, the Alaska Air Carriers, the Port of Bellingham, the Motion Picture Association were some of my very earliest clients.
The Motion Picture Association in the early 80s?
Yeah.
Yeah. What were they?
Well, at that point, we had a film office, and we had a film tax credit program that was started. And there was also a lot of issues about the way local movie theaters acquired feature films and the rules under which they could show those films. That was an active period. We actually had feature films made in Alaska during those days, but that program ended up going away during one of our oil crises when the price of oil dipped low enough that we couldn't afford that anymore.
Do you remember any of the movies that were made here?
I think there was John Boyd was in Runaway Train. There was a movie about sled dogs. There was Timber Tramps.
And were those getting filmed all over, or was
No, the film industry they've evolved to following the states that have a film tax credit program. So most films get made in California, in Georgia, in Louisiana, places where there's some incentive for them to do their films. And since our program has gone away, we have a lot of reality shows. Alaska films are filmed in British Columbia, or I was in Iceland a few years ago, and I visited a community that True Detective was shot in.
interesting?
And that was portrayed as an Alaska community.
Does Iceland offer some sort of credit?
Yeah, they have a credit program over there. And there's a lot of places that kind of look like Alaska. So
Right.
it's pretty easy to pretend that you're here.
How do you get started as a lobbyist? Because you were very young still.
Yeah, I was young. It was a fluke because I wanted to live in Juneau, and all my experience had been with government for 10 or 11 years. And I don't think any lobbyist starts out to be a lobbyist. It just happens. And I came back, and because I was in the Department of Natural Resources, I ended up doing some consulting, and I worked on the right-of-way for the Red Dog Mine in the Nana region. I worked on buying and selling some old cannery property as some of the historic cannery businesses went out, and people purchased and sold those properties. And through those contacts, I ended up lobbying. And it's one of those things where if you can develop enough clients during the first few years, it's worth continuing. But if you don't, then you go on to something else. I never intended to do it, but now 40 some years later, I'm still doing it.
Did you meet your wife during that period?
Yeah, I met her when I was a legislative staffer, and she's a journalist. She was covering the session. She worked for the public radio, public TV, Anchorage Daily News, 100 Times, a variety of...
Which session was she covering?
This was 76 or 78
Oh,
when I was
so you
working
met
for Senator
really young.
Poland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And y'all have one son.
Yeah, we have one son, Daniel, who's 34 now, and he lives in Park City, Utah. Big
Okay.
skier.
You stumbled into lobbying, as most people do, and not really that long later, you started the Juneau Community Foundation.
Yeah, it was 7 years later, the three of us decided that we didn't really know anything about community foundations, but we decided that it would be good to have an organization to allow people to either donate money or leave money to a local group that could then decide how to use the money best, because programs that we grew up with, like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, or public radio, or the Arts Council, they come and go, and nobody knows whether those groups will be the appropriate places to put your money in the future. We set it up for that reason, and at the time, I thought we'd be doing really well if we ever got $5 million in our fund, but we have $80 million now.
Well, I'm super grateful because I live in the Assembly Building, and that was one of your guys' projects, was to purchase the building. And I guess tell me about that idea and how you guys participated.
In the Community Foundation, there's big funds set up for social service programs and for homeless and domestic abuse and addiction and stuff like that. But then we also have a fairly significant fund that was set up to help keep the Capitol in Juneau. And through that fund, we've done a number of projects. We purchased the Barron's house across the street. Originally, we bought it for the legislature, but the administration ended up wanting more, so we gave it to the administration. We spent a lot of money on gavel-to-gavel equipment here in the building. Some of the physical improvements to the building we paid for. And then we bought the Assembly Building and gave that to the legislature, and we also contributed a good chunk of the money for the renovation of that building, just because housing is a perpetual issue for
So it's
legislators.
interesting. So you gave it
Yeah.
to the legislature. I'm just going to contrast that with some other organizations that we have that say that they can't do things because they won't make money off of it, or they have to be profitable, they have to keep themselves in business. The model of spending millions of dollars and just giving it to the legislature, it just seems so different than the types of organizations that I'm used to dealing with, where I say, can you help these elderly, poor people live somewhere? We're not sure that there's any money in affordable senior housing, so we'll have to pass. And it drives me crazy.
Yeah. Having the capital here is incredibly important for the economy of Juneau. And so Juneau has always tried to make improvements at local expense or even through philanthropic means to make the capital better. So that's something we've always done. It's a tradition here. And we'll continue to do it. Our fund is, we're still looking for projects in the future. So if you have any ideas.
Oh my gosh, man. I hope you inspire some other agencies to be a little bit more generous with how they think about spending their money. Because like I said, it's been very frustrating to work with folks who say that their mission is to, help with housing, for example, and then say that unfortunately they have to make sure that they make a profit.
Yeah, we give away about $5 million a year now to almost all of our local nonprofits, and I don't think we make money on anything.
I love that. I want to bounce back. Do you have a particular story about how you met your wife?
Yeah, I was in one of the committee rooms. In fact, it might have been your Judiciary Committee room at the time, and the Senate Resources was meeting, and she used to come in with her tape recorder and microphone and interview legislators at the time. And that's when, I think it was after the...
Were you staffing the meeting? Were you the committee aide?
I was the committee aide at the time. So I paid attention to everything that was going on in the room. But that's how we met, and we've been together since the late 70s.
You just said hi, or...
Actually, what happened, it was funny, my sister-in-law was also working for Senator Poland, and she had the same last name. And so when I first asked out my wife, she thought that I was married to my brother's wife.
How did your brother, so your brother was in Alaska as well?
Yeah. Like all good Alaska families, I was the pioneer, and then attracted my siblings up here. And I had my brother actually worked for the legislature for quite a while. He worked for Senator Sackett when he was here.
Oh, really?
Yep.
He has to have stories about working for Johnny Sackett.
Oh yeah, John was he was a very interesting guy and a very effective legislator. He was the chairman of the Finance Committee for a number of years and extremely effective at what he did.
I did a special order on the floor about 1975, and he was the sponsor of the resolution to change the name from McKinley to Denali.
Oh, he was? Okay.
Yep. And then he followed it all the way through till 40 years later.
Yeah. John was from Ruby, and I know my brother went up and went moose hunting with John a few times. And I knew him well too, because when I was with the Rural Cap program, one of my friends was Jimmy Huntington, who was on the board, and Jimmy was from Galena in that same area. And he took me on a trip for a couple of weeks up the Koyukuk River back in the early 70s, which is still one of the greatest trips I've ever had in Alaska. But I met John at that same time when he was a young legislator.
There was some fallout after the coup involving the Senate. The guy from Bethel, Homan, was taking bribes, and that's like what he got caught doing. But here was the pushback from Disco Ray. Everyone was taking bribes. I don't know what from your perspective, what was happening then.
No, I mean, I was kind of thinking about that I've worked with hundreds of legislators over the years, and there have been a few instances where that happened, but pretty rare in comparison to other states. Look at Louisiana or almost any other state where that was a routine thing. It was pretty rare in Alaska, and I don't remember a case where it ever amounted to something that was a massive bribe or anything like that. They tended to be.
So something that's changed over the decades is how much legislators get paid. Their salary probably looks pretty good, but then there's no adjustments for a long period of time, and then the salaries are not so good anymore. Right now, we're the third highest paid state legislators in the country. It's California, Pennsylvania, Alaska. And I wonder if you think that when Alaska state legislators are well paid, if they're more immune to that sort of behavior, or if there's any correspondence with the salary at all.
It probably is. I think for a long time, Alaskan legislators were way underpaid compared to the nation. And it's a big sacrifice to move down to Juneau, and you have to have an apartment or a place to live down here, and you have all of your expenses in addition to your expenses at home. So it's always been a public service sacrifice to be a legislator. Having better pay makes it easier for either lower income or people with large families to become legislators. So I think that's a good thing. But I think a lot of the reason why Alaskan legislators were underpaid for a long time is that there have been lots of periods when Alaska hasn't had much money. Boom or bust. There was a couple periods when we were flush with money, but most of the time, we've been short. And,
Speaking of bribes and having lots of money, there was the Vico scandal,
right,
where some bribes happened, although some of them were so small and seemed
Right.
so insignificant and honestly like some sort of terrible tragedy, like Vic Coring and like that taking such little money for
Right.
his daughter. It's just, it's like almost brings tears to your eyes. Like, why is this person doing this?
Yeah. No, there weren't. I don't recall instances where it was demonstrated that there were any large sums of money or large favors.
Well, there
that
were,
being-
yeah, but I would say following Vico, we had ACES and we went from 4 billion in the CBR to 18 billion in the CBR. There was,
and then back before
and
again.
then back. Yeah. But there was a brief period after Vico when we were flush with money again.
Right. But that's also when oil prices were incredibly high. It was
Yes.
$120, $130 a barrel, and we're at what, 70 now, and
Right.
the possibility of lower revenue. That's been one of the, if you look back over time, ever since I got here, the big variable in Alaska has been the state's finances, because we're so dependent on oil, and with high production and high prices, we've got lots of money. With low production and low prices, we're really short of money. And the permanent fund, it was probably the biggest success story in Alaska's history, in my opinion, that it was set up for the right reason, and it's accomplishing a lot of what it was intended to do today. We're still not there yet, but
As somebody who was here when the permanent fund was founded, is this what you imagine the permanent fund would serve? Do you feel like that the intent that it's met its goal?
it has been its goal. I think the interesting part of it is the dividend program, because when the permanent fund was established in 76, there was no talk about a dividend program. Those discussions started in 1980. From Governor Hammond wanted to give people a stake in the fund to make sure that it didn't get spent away. Because when the permanent fund was first created, there was a debate in the legislature: should we invest it outside, as we finally chose to do, or we should invest it in Alaska and use it for our own development? And that was a big debate, and I think that there was some concern, that that the public needed to protect the fund. So that was a good thing. But then the dividend program morphed over time and took on a life of its own. And if there hadn't been a dividend program, we'd have 130 billion or so in the permanent fund. And the permanent fund dividends have dictated politics for a long time. That's the more interesting part of it. But the permanent fund itself has served it was for exactly the situation we're in today. And the legislature has been pretty responsible. They've contributed to inflation proofing and put a lot of money into the permanent fund that they weren't required to.
So I interviewed Fran Ulmer. She was staff to Jay Hammond.
Right.
She was in the office when the decision to completely repeal the state income tax
Right.
came across, and Jay Hammond wanted to veto it, and the staff encouraged him not to because it would just be another veto override. Jay Hammond was overridden, I believe, 14 times by the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, don't do this. It's just going to be symbolic. It's not going to matter. They will override you. And I believe that was one of his regrets. He wishes that he vetoed it, even if they overrid it. He wished that he'd made that statement.
Yeah, I do recall that's accurate. At the time, the legislature would have overridden him because we didn't need the income tax, and I guess we still don't have it today. But it's the dividend that complicates the whole thing, because everybody loves their dividend and would like to receive it, but now it's in conflict with essential state services. And I think a lot of us, even back in the day, realized that someday we're going to end up with a situation where people have relied on the dividend for a program for a long time. It's really hard to take it back when you need it.
Mm-hmm.
And we end up with a situation we've been in for a number of years where legislators and people in the state are divided about what should be the future of it.
Yesterday, in a subcommittee meeting, we had folks talking about the Department of Health's budget. This was the subcommittee that I was in, and talking about how when you look at it over time, it just seems to get bigger and bigger. There's some sort of weird psychological maneuvering happening in some people's brains to think that departments of the state government don't have the same pressures from inflation that absolutely every other entity in the state has, and that we must keep up with inflation. And that is not growing government. That is keeping government the same.
That's generally true, that the budget, in spite of what some people think, the budget's been pretty flat for a number of years because you're required to balance the budget within your revenues, and we haven't had enough revenue that the budget's been constrained, and we're actually spending lower per capita than we used to. But it's hard to change because the three biggest expenditures in the budget are the permanent fund dividend, Department of Education, Medicaid. Just like the federal government and Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Those big formula programs, they're the dominant share of the budget. You could cut every department in a lot of years, and you still would make a big difference in terms of the overall budget.
3 more questions. The first is, as a lobbyist, is it your instinct to take every client that approaches you?
No, I've been lucky and I've been really selective in my clients. I've only taken on clients that I agree with and that I like. And so I've been pretty fortunate. I've had primarily business clients, although I did represent municipal government and I represent the Alaska Lung Association. But I've never taken a client that has a conflict of interest, and I've never taken an oil company. I'm one of the few lobbyists that never took an oil company.
No matter how much they would have paid you?
No, it's just, elect legislators who get in a comfort zone about what we feel good about it and it'd be hard to represent a company that you didn't agree with. So I've been lucky that I've had people that I've generally agreed with and that have been great to work for. I've learned a lot.
Have you ever judged other lobbyists for the choices they've made?
There's some lobbyists that have taken a lot more clients than I would have. There's occasionally you run into conflicts of interest that, just like in the law practice.
And we see these lobbyists who are representing opposing folks.
Yeah, that's a tough thing to do. Just as a law practice, you wouldn't take clients that had conflict of interest, and lobbying should be the same way. And I've also been lucky, and I've had long-term clients that I've got to learn their business, got to learn the people that work for them, and that I feel like you're more effective if you actually understand the business that you're representing, as opposed to ones where you do what they say you should do, but you don't really understand it.
You did an Ironman at age 65.
Yeah, I was never a big athlete growing up, but I started running when I was in my 40s and ran the Klondike Relay, and then my friends got me into biking, so I started doing biking. And then I had friends that did the triathlons, but I was never a swimmer, so my reluctance was learning how to swim well enough to...
How old were you when you started working on your swimming?
I was probably late 50s, 60 years old.
That is an inspirational story.
And I actually got better. I got into it and I really liked it, and I actually was improving right up through until I was almost 70. And then age is catching up to me now, so my times have been going down, and my joints are creakier than they used to be. But it was a lot of fun because I met a lot of great people and traveled all over and did a number of events.
You did a half Ironman with Neil Foster in Victoria?
Yeah, Neil is, I think, the only legislator that I know that liked to do triathlons. And we went to Victoria together and did a half Ironman. Oh, it was probably 5 or 6 years ago. It was a lot of fun.
For those who don't know, the Ironman that you did at age 65, what are the distances?
Swim 2.5 miles, then you get to bike 112 miles, and then run a marathon.
You did that at 65. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy, but I think it takes over your life, because if you actually get into that, you have to train every day, and every weekend you have to do long events. So it takes over becomes your dominant activity outside of work. So it was great fun during all the times I did it. But then when COVID happened and they quit having events in person, and there wasn't as much incentive to train. And then once I quit training, I realized that I had a lot of time to go fishing or play golf or do other fun stuff.
When you were in the heat of it, like really training, did your wife say like, who did I marry? What is happening?
She gave me a hard time on the one hand, but I suppose it's better than, some of the
Oh, yeah.
some of the midlife things I could have pursued. So.
Do you think that it's kept you younger?
Oh yeah, no, I feel even at 76, I still feel great, and I'm able to do a lot of the activities I've always done. So thank goodness for that.
My dad told me once, like when he was around 76 or 77, he's like, I still see myself as like an 18-year-old. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, my brain is still back in college days. and physically, up until recently, I felt like I could do what I always do. Now I'm slowing down some, but I still want to try to hang on as long as I can, because this is the time of life when you're more content and you don't worry about the future so much, and it's a good opportunity to see the world or do stuff that you always wanted to do but never took the time to do.
Do you have any big trips planned?
Yeah, later this year I try to do a couple of international trips. I'm going to do a fly fishing trip in Mexico and one in the Bahamas later in the year, and we have a place in Bend, Oregon, so I'll go down there and see summer if we're not getting summer in Alaska.
What advice would you give to someone like me who really had no relationship with politics and is, I stepped foot in the building the first time after I'd been elected. Mm-hmm. And it was all an accident and nothing planned. And this was never my intent. I guess having been somebody who's been in the building for 50 years, what advice do you give to a new legislator like me who hasn't?
Well, I think it's good because I would urge you to keep some of your fresh ideas, because when you've been ingrained in politics, you lose some of your enthusiasm, your inventiveness. And if you go back to the 70s, there were a lot of young legislators who didn't have experience in politics, and yet somehow they managed to come up with a permanent fund, and there were a lot of great ideas that happened. Bringing fresh ideas into the building is a good thing. Bringing bipartisanship into the building is a good thing. And my experience in the building is that the successful legislators are ones that had good interpersonal relationships with their colleagues on both sides of the aisle. So if you can develop those, you'll have more support with the things that you want to do than if you get pigeonholed into only being able to work with a subset of the legislature. And there's a lot of work required. That the successful legislators, they come to the committee prepared and they do their homework. They read their bills when they're on the floor. They know what they're voting for. And it takes a lot of time and effort. Those legislators that are willing to do that often get a lot more of their stuff done than those that don't.
Do lobbyists know who the legislators are who are doing their homework and are working hard, and those that are just barely showing up?
Oh, yeah. Over time, if you get to observe a couple hundred legislators like I have, it doesn't usually take long to figure out who's likely to thrive and, who will have a little bit of tougher time. But again, it's hard. Legislators come in with all different backgrounds. Some have backgrounds that are really well suited to the legislature, some not so much, but they're all sent here by their constituents because they see something in that person that leads to trust. But that's what makes this such an interesting process, that no matter how messy it gets, it always works.
Have you had relationships with governors over the years?
11. I worked with 11 different governors, 19 presidents of the Senate, and 19 speakers of the House. I made a list because I couldn't even remember them all. But
who would you say, what governor did you have the best relationship with out of the 11?
Probably Governor Hammond, just because I worked for his administration before I lobbied, and he was a great guy. I had a good relationship with Governor Knowles when he was here. But all the governors, I've been able to keep some relationship with every governor, and they've all had their challenges, and they've all been successful at some of what they wanted and not successful at others. But as a lobbyist, you really learn to work with the people from both parties and with a lot of different backgrounds.
And did you have a particular Speaker of the House or President of the Senate that you had a good relationship with?
I've had good relationships with most of them. I think in terms of longevity, I think Jay Kurtula served 3 terms as Senate president. Gary Stevens is on his 3rd, so they've got the record on the Senate side. Mike Chenault and had 4 terms in the House, so he had the record over here. But when I walk by those pictures on the wall as you're going into the House chambers, I knew or worked with almost all of them, and pretty good luck with all of them, actually.
A last question I ask of everybody who's been on the podcast is if they have a book they want to recommend. Do you have a book that you'd recommend to listeners?
Actually, 2 books. One is Jimmy Huntington's book, On the Edge of Nowhere. It's probably hard to find, but it was one of the best books I've read in Alaska because it was his life growing up as a Koyukon native during the subsistence days. And then he was a famous dog sled musher. So that's just a fascinating book. Another book that I love that's tangentially about Alaska is Where the Sea Breaks Its Back. It's the story of George Steller and Vitus Bering when they did their cruise to Alaska. And they really didn't know anything about Alaska. They landed in Southeast. They went to Prince William Sound. They ended up stranded in Bering Island and spent the winter. Had to tear down their boats, recreate their boats, lost most of the people. But that's a fascinating book too, one of my favorite.
Yeah, that book, a book like that, I'm always curious about how much they're making up and how much is real. Like, how do they know exactly what happened?
Because we have access to a lot of the journals from those people, so I think it's a pretty accurate book. And like I said, that's a real adventure.
Yeah.
But just fascinating when it took them 5 years from the time that Peter the Great sent them on this voyage. They had to march across Russia. They had to build their own boats in Kamchatka, launch into one of the roughest oceans in the world without any idea where they're going. Ended up in northern southeast Alaska. They sent some people ashore, and they never came back. They sent another group on shore, and they never came back. And they went up to Prince William Sound, and George Steller was a biologist who was looking forward to seeing new plants, animals, and people. He gets on shore in Montague Island or Kayak Island, and he's only there for 1 day, and Captain Bering tells them that they have to leave because he's worried about getting back for wintertime, which turned out to be a problem. But imagine George Steller spending 6
all
or
that
7
time
years
for
and then
one day.
for 1 day, and he sees every animal he sees, or that nobody's reported on before, and he runs into an old native camp and stuff. But anyway, he turned out to be one of the saviors of the group because of his background. He kept people from getting scurvy and helped people through the winter when they had to camp on Bering Island on the way home.
Reed Stoops, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Sure, thanks. It was fun. Thank you.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-465-4940.